Hi, we continue in Genesis 31 today as Jacob has given his speech to try to persuade his primary wives, Rachel and Leah, to side with him rather than side with their father, and we hear their response today. And although we're only going to look at 5 verses from 31:14 to 18, as you can see on the left side of the screen, that completes both almost this entire unit, and we'll see how this other section is its own chiasm. But as we've been looking at, completes the chiasm that we've been looking at here since 28:10. This entire section of Jacob on his way to Haran, and now he's leaving. And as we see this process here, as I've been noting throughout, as the wives' sisters say, "Are we not regarded by their father as foreigners here, as Nakri?" This really is the center of the entire story here, which is to say that two different peoples are being made out of one. Jacob is with his cousins and with his uncle, and this is really one extended family. And yet the wives and sisters here and daughters, they're all of those at the same time, see themselves as outsiders to their father, to the old way of life. So they will side with Jacob and they will leave with him, and they will bring about the new nation that's to be when on the way back Jacob has the experience of someone wrestling with him and renaming him as Israel. And suddenly all these children born in Mesopotamia are now the Bnei Israel, the sons of Israel, a new people. And that's at one level. But at another level, as we've been saying, we can read this at 3 levels. At the post-exilic level, this is the question of leaving Babylon and deciding who we are after 50 years in Babylon, which is to say something like Cubans leaving Florida to go back to Cuba after a generation or two. How American would they be in Florida, and how much would they be Cuban when they go back? And that was certainly one of the questions of the exilists' return. And the Ezra-Nehemiah perspective, as we look at, said to be pure, in their perspective, you have to get rid of foreign wives and the children of those foreign wives in order to be part of the restored community, that the so-called holy seed cannot be mixed with unclean seed. But in our story here in Genesis, all people are made in the image and likeness of God, so there is no unholy seed. There's only unholy behavior and unholy cultures. The people themselves are all made good, but different cultures work in ways that are either according to Yahweh, the Creator's ways, or against it. So in this situation, we've seen that Laban, representing the old way of Mesopotamia, with his name representing the symbol of the moon god Sin, and the entire way of Mesopotamia, is a cheater and a patriarch, and concerned with money rather than with relationships. And we see that his daughters, although they side with Jacob, are also primarily concerned with wealth. Nothing is mentioned of their children, nothing is mentioned of relationship, and really nothing is mentioned of changing gods. All they seem to be concerned with is that their father has taken away their stuff, and they want to be with their stuff. So they would have to go through their own transformation, and that's part of the whiteness that comes with the spottedness, so if you'll say, part of the old country that comes as in the formation of a new people. As is always the case when people try to either recreate an old identity out of one that's been polluted, if you will, by colonialism or empire, or try to recreate a new one. And I experienced this when I was in Chiapas, Mexico, when people who'd been subject to Spanish and Mexican colonialism had to rediscover and really create from scratch their own indigenous culture that had been destroyed after centuries of slavery and cultural appropriation. So we can see that happens in the ancient world to our biblical ancestors, and also in many places in the modern world as well. So as we enter into our story, as I've been noting, the chiasm that forms this unit, we noted that, and also the parallels with the wife-sister stories. And here we're really seeing with this move in this scene that we're looking at here, the sense of leaving behind a foreign territory with all the property and the slaves, etc., as Abraham and Isaac had left, respectively, Egypt and Gerar earlier. And key also today is this ongoing revelation here of reading this entire story of Laban and his daughters as an allegory of the monarchy and exile. And I've been pointing to the sections we're on here today. This one is slightly out of chronological order, so this one was actually for last time. But this is where we are here, that we see their response is almost identical to the response of the Israelites rejecting the son of Solomon, Rehoboam, saying, what share do we have in David, which is to say, what share in the monarchy, which is what's seen as foreign, as we've been looking at throughout this whole unit. So that's a part of what's being rejected here from the perspective of exile. That when they return from exile, in contrary to the Ezra and Nehemiah situation, which calls for obeying the law of God and the law of the Persian king as an expression of God's will, here we have a rejection completely of monarchy and simply people going back and being on the land in direct relationship with Yahweh. And we'll see more of how that unplays in the rest of the Jacob cycle, and also how it plays contrapuntally in the Joseph story that follows later and was written later, as we'll see. So returning to our keywords, interestingly, all the many unique words and special keywords that created such rhythm and sound patterns that we saw earlier, including word plays, is gone now. There's none of that down here. Simply the intertextual references we saw to 1 Kings, and there's a similar one in 2 Samuel earlier, and then the unique words here in this final verse, which I've translated literally when we get there. So we reach the conclusion of our story where they make their choice. As my note below has, from Lapsy, we hear this. The women's dispute with their father shares a formal similarity with the men's respective complaints, and all three parties begin their accusations with a string of angry questions directed at the offending party. For Jacob and Laban's questions, see verses 26 and 36. But the difference is that the women do not, and I argue cannot, in neither the story nor in ancient Israelite culture, address their complaints directly to the offending party Laban. That they never direct their anger toward Laban means he cannot and does not respond, and that their dispute cannot therefore be adjudicated in the same way that the men's is. And I'd like to suggest that's an element of what we'll see in what follows when Laban catches up with them, and Rachel offers a little message that she can't move because the way of women is upon her. And so we'll look at how Lapsy's comment here will play into the question of the way of men and the way of women, and how both the women take advantage of that and Israel takes advantage of that, taking on the women's role in international disputes. And Jacob, the mama's boy who was in the tent, will be the representative of that, as we'll see. So Rachel and Leah answer as one voice, the only time they're united, perhaps like Israel and Judah leaving Babylon, although technically, according to the biblical story in 2 Kings, only Judah goes into Babylonian exile. Israel had been colonized by Assyria 100 and something years earlier, and so that was a separate story in 2 Kings. And so perhaps the remnant that Josiah brought in comprises a momentary unity between Israel and Judah, but we can't know for sure. But perhaps it's symbolic of that. So Rachel and Leah answer him, is there any portion or inheritance left to us in our father's house? The word portion, sholach, here in the Septuagint, the Greek meris, only here in 1424 in Genesis, but 69 times in the Hebrew Bible is a legal term. But Wenham suggests it's a hendiadys with inheritance, which is to say two words joined by an and or an or that suggests one common notion, which is to say a share in the land. So this is not necessarily about money or property, although they take it that way. The formula is often about land, and that's how it plays out, certainly in the parallel here in 2 Kings. Here, what share do we have in David, which is to say no inheritance in Jerusalem, and then they leave and go to their tents, as the description says. Inheritance, vanahala here, or in the Septuagint, kleronomia, only in 48:6 when we get to the inheritance questions, when Jacob is about to give his dying words over each of his sons, and also a legal term. So they're using legal language here in a situation that is not formally a legal situation. They're just talking to their husband directly, and as far as we know, there's nobody there except us as readers. But the author has this formal language in their mind so that we can associate it with more formal situations. And what they're renouncing is their father's house. Notice not the land, not Haran, not Mesopotamia, not their religion, which is to say the moon god Sin, or perhaps the wider warrior god Marduk, the king god for the whole Babylonian Empire. They don't mention any of that, but simply their father's house. Keeping this at the level of the family story when we look at it this way in the immediate plot, but we also know it is this question of the two nations, as we've been seeing. So they continue this way. After that rhetorical question, they ask this: are we not regarded by him as foreigners? The are we not regarded term here in the Niphal, only here in Genesis, although it's not in Niphal in a few other places. And it will be parallels we'll see in chapter 38 to Judah's mistaken impression of Tamar as a prostitute. So it often has to do with people perceiving people as something they're not. And the word for foreign here, nakri here, is only here in Genesis. It's different than how the Sodomites perceived Lot and how Hagar was perceived as a gar, or ger, and literally Hagar, the foreigner, or or the refugee in that case. We recall in chapter 19 that the Sodomites rejected Lot's advice of providing hospitality for the strangers because they said, "You've come here as a gur and you're going to give us advice," and they reject him. And so here, the daughters perceive themselves as treated by their father as foreigners. And this is on this basis. He has sold us. Literally, they have not been sold. But as Lapsey notes below, quoting Susan Nidich, the daughters of Laban describe themselves in the relationship to their father as exploited and dispossessed slaves, treated as foreign women unrelated to him. And implicitly, as the Egyptians did with Hagar, in providing her to Abraham in exchange for the restoration of honor over the Sarai situation. So he has sold us, and he's been using up the money given for us. Literally, eaten, yes, eaten, and I have that here, eaten the silver given for us. Almost always when the word money is provided in the English translation, it's the Hebrew silver here, and that will really play out in the Joseph story. So that's the issue. They feel they're personally sold, and he's been eating up the money given to them. We don't know what silver that is. They were not given a dowry as such, but presumably that's the value of all the animals that we know that Jacob must have exchanged in some way to get the slaves and the camels that were not part of his agricultural, or not part of his shepherding duties. But they're not done yet, as we hear here. As my note below has, and I put it in quotes because this is not a biblical idea, but the karmic circle. They interpret the situation that since Laban took the wealth from them, God took it from Laban and gave it back to them via Jacob. And throughout this, they cite Elohim as the source of this. And they've gone along with the God that that Jacob notes here. Is also the God of Jesus, but that's not where we are in our story, of course. And no mention at all throughout this entire story by the daughters or by the father of the local gods. And so they all agree that Elohim or Yahweh is the one responsible for the behavior here. All the property here, literally Osher here, only here in the Pentateuch 37 times in the Hebrew scripture. Next in 1 Samuel and then in Kings, notice these connections with the monarchy story there. And that's not listed as a rare word, even though it's only here in the Pentateuch because it's 37 times in the Hebrew Bible. But several words for property here, and we see property, livestock acquired down here, and we'll look more closely at verse 18 in a minute. All the property that God has taken away from our father. Notice again that they attribute this to God here. Jacob had attributed to God, and they understand his view of the situation. And it belongs to us. Notice that Jacob said it was mine, and they claim us. And so they're now on the side of Jacob on this, and to our children. And they're only mentioned here. There's no sense of the children being the important part of the story, simply that all the property is what belongs to them and their children. So having said that, they now turn it over to Jacob. Now then, do whatever God has said to you. And we don't hear that they have any direct relationship with God, as Rebecca did in the oracle that she got while she was pregnant, and that even Hagar had in the wilderness after she'd been kicked out by Sarah. And so they're having to rely simply on Jacob's experience to trust his version, his theological argument that this is what God has done, and it works. So having that work, now Jacob goes into action here. And we see this is one of a series of travel reports, starting with Terah's journey from Ur, and then Abram's journey from Haran into Canaan, and now this journey is being reversed. So Jacob arose literally and stood up, standing up for himself in that sense, and set his children and his wives on camels, which, as I noted in chapter 24 with the camels, is anachronistic. When Rebecca's put on the camel on the way home, camels were pack animals and were not ridden in this context, or in the 2nd century context in which the story takes place. But the authors aren't worrying about the anachronism of that any more than they're worrying about the anachronism of everybody in the story speaking Hebrew in Paddan Aram. And let's look at this verse down here so we can see how stately it is. As my note here has the solemn nature of the procession's description. So we hear it this way down here. Jacob arose and set his children and his women on camels, and he drove away all his gathered livestock, all the property that he had gathered, the livestock in his possession that he had gathered in Paddan Aram, to go to his father Isaac in the land of Canaan. So the verb for gathered here 3 times here, and several different words words for livestock. So we hear livestock here, mikna, which, as I've noted before, is the general word for cattle. And this forms a little chiasm in the repeat of these verbs. You can see mikna repeated here, and rashash for gather repeated there, and asher. So just a little chiasm within this verse. But it's really setting up the stately procession of this in the course of gathering this. And there's a lot. There's 12 children. There's all these animals. There's the slaves. There's the camel. And as you can see from the picture here, that's also the cover picture of this video, a lot of stuff, highlighting that he'd acquired it in Paddan Aram, not Haran here, framing with 28:2, with beyond the chiasm, but framing all the way back to the departure, and framing with Canaan, which we'll next see in 33:18, and then in 35:9 a couple more times in the end of the Jacob cycle, and then a reference back at the end of the Joseph story. And notice it says, to return to his father Isaac in the land of Canaan, but no mention of Rebekah. And Rebekah was the one he'd been closest to. It was Rebekah who finally sent him off. I had taken the interpretation among the variety of interpretations that the blessing scene was a conspiracy between Isaac and Rebekah to get Jacob to practice deceiving his father to be prepared for all that we've just seen happened here in Paddan Aram under the deceptive control of Laban. But it's curious here that he reports that what he wants to do, or the narrator reports rather, is to go back to his father and not to both his parents or not to Rebekah. And no mention is made of Esau here, even though we might know as readers that that's in fact what's going to happen. He's going to go to Esau, but that wasn't his plan. That'll only happen because we'll hear a report comes that Esau is coming with 400 men, and Jacob has to do something about it. But at this point, he has no apparent plan to reunite with Esau, and wouldn't know where Esau was for that matter. So we continue here in the land of Canaan, the first time we've seen it since the call to Abram back in 12:5, starting the entire story there from the land of Canaan. And so, what will Laban and his sons do? As we'll see momentarily, Rachel stole his father's teraphim, and the chase will be on. And we'll see what happens with that chase next time. See you then. Bye-bye.